Yes, yes, yes. And we are live on YouTube. We are live in the Zoom. Welcome, everybody. Welcome to Bible study. We are so excited to see you again for another amazing studying of God's word. Now, here's the thing for those of you who are watching live on YouTube, you will not see slides tonight. However, you will still see the conversation. You will still be able to make comments. And we've got Miss Amber who's going to be managing YouTube for us. So please, please, please join in the conversation. Please share the link with anyone else who needs this information, because tonight what we're going to do is we're going to piggyback off of last week's conversation about the flood. And we're going to look at some really hot topics in the Bible. We're going to be looking at the Noahic covenant, number one. We're going to be looking at quote unquote the curse of Ham, to really look at how that has affected us, and is it a real thing, right? We're going to look at some of the history of that. We're also going to look at some individuals that we don't really talk about a lot in this story. So I'm really excited. And I know tonight's going to be amazing. I see we have more people coming in. Hi, Miss Carol. Welcome, welcome, welcome. 1 second. Let me just make sure that give me a second, everybody, while we get it together. I want to make sure you all can hear me clearly. Awesome, awesome. All right, so let me go ahead. For those of you, like I said again, those of you who are on YouTube, unfortunately, you won't be able to see the slides, but you'll still be able to be in the conversation. So let's go ahead and get started. All right, we got more people coming in. All right, give me a second. We're going to make Miss Amber a co-host here so she can help me to let people in. Hey, everybody coming in. Hello, hello, hello. Welcome, 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 welcome. So excited to see you. Okay, so once again, I'm Tammy and this is Amber. We are your moderators. Should you have any problems, those of you on YouTube, those of you in the Zoom, just reach out to Amber. She'll be able to help you. Also, please use the chat button, because we really, really, really want to get your comments. We really want to get your feedback. We like interaction as we jump into God's word. And as I just mentioned a few moments ago, we're going to do a couple of things in this Bible study tonight. We're going to be looking at what happened during and after the flood. We're also going to be looking at some things from the book of Jasher. So for those of you who are not familiar, but the book of Jasher is one of the lost books, and it also tells the story of the flood, but it gives some more details. And so what we're going to do tonight, we're not going to necessarily read line by line like we normally do in our Bible studies. What we're going to do instead is kind of do a summary and then see how these different books and topics flow together. All right. If you all can see my screen, just go ahead and give me a little thumbs up. Awesome. Awesome. All right. So let's go over. If you have your Bible, you can turn to Genesis chapter 7 and chapter 8. And as I said, we are going to do a quick we're going to run through this story because everybody pretty much knows the story of Noah. And if you want to go line by line, you can definitely go read it for your own in Genesis 7. But here's some of the big highlights when it comes to the story of Genesis 7. So for those of you who weren't on last week, let's do a quick recap, okay? So last week we talked about why the flood was needed. And we talked a lot about kind of the truth about the flood, right? We also looked at the book of Enoch, which is one of the lost books, which gives us a lot more detail. And one of the things that we found in the book of Enoch, when we just read Genesis, it really looks like God is punishing the world, right? But when we read the book of Enoch, we get more details about what was really happening and how evil was basically coming onto earth, and God basically saved the world by establishing the flood so that basically there could be a new start. So if you have not seen that Bible study, it's on our YouTube channel. So please go and watch that and you'll be able to catch up on that. Okay. And so now this is after God has basically said, hey, we're going to clear it out. We're going to start fresh. And we're going to give mankind a brand new start that doesn't have evil spirits here on earth. Okay. And so in chapter 7 and 8, some of the highlights that we see is number one, God instructs Noah to build the ark. He instructs him to take his family. So it's Noah, his wife. Noah has 3 sons, which we'll talk a little bit more about as we go through the Bible study tonight. He has 3 sons and they all have wives. Okay. So in total, we have 8 people who are basically going to repopulate the world. We also see Noah has God tells Noah to put 7 pairs of each animal. So really it should be 14 pairs of each animal onto the ark. And the main thing that we see when we read through that whole section of Genesis 7 and 8 is that basically Noah did exactly what God told him to do. Now, what's significant about that? What's significant is that, number one, there had never been rain before. So Noah had never seen rain before. Okay. But he had to believe and have faith in what God told him, that there's going to be so much rain that basically the world was going to be destroyed and you were going to be the one that was saved. So he was literally building this ark based on faith, right? Which all in of itself is kind of an amazing thing. I have not gone down to, where is it, Amber? Is it in Kansas? It's Kansas or Tennessee? I can't remember exactly where it is, but it's on my Kentucky. That's where it is. It's in Kentucky, y'all, where you can actually go to the museum where they rebuilt Noah's Ark. And from what I understand, they show you basically how this would have happened. They did the measurements exactly the way that it is on the Bible. So that's on my to-do list, one of the things that I really want to do. And my aunt went, and one of the things that she said that helped her, that made a lot of sense for her, she said when they brought the animals on, they were baby animals, right? So you're like, how did he get elephants and how did he get, giraffes and all of this stuff on the ark? And it's like, well, if you think about it in terms of baby animals, it makes a whole lot more sense. And so I'm like, wow, I really want to see that. So if anyone has ever been interested in doing that tour, definitely highly recommend, go ahead and do it so that you can expand your biblical knowledge. Okay. So he did exactly what God told him to do. The second thing is that it rains for 40 days and 40 nights. And you'll see all throughout the Bible, when different things happen, you see this 40 days or 40 nights over and over and over again. There's something very significant about the number 40. You'll see that God works oftentimes in increments of 40 days. Okay. Even when Jesus was tempted, it says that he was in the desert for 40 days, right? So you see that over and over and over again. So that does have significance. It says this, the flood waters covered the earth for 150 days. And I believe, if the math is right, I think in the Bible, it says 5 months, right? So for 5 months, it rained, covering the earth. And it said that it covered mountains. It was the most water the earth had ever seen. And so Noah and his family actually remained on that ark for over a year, okay? Or a little under a year, I should say. And then after, almost a year, Noah's family is let off the ark. And the first thing that Noah does is he builds an altar to make a sacrifice to God, right? And God was pleased with the sacrifice that Noah gave to him, right? Because the animals that he sacrificed with were approved by God. And so one of the themes that we've been seeing as we've been all studying together is this theme of obedience, right? This theme of not doing things simply the way that we want to do it, but the way that God intends for us to do it and for us to please God. And so we see that, when we've talked about it last week, Noah was a good man. Noah was a righteous man. Noah was a blameless man, right? So he was a man after God's own heart. And so one of the things that's really interesting is that as soon as he gets off the ark, the first thing he does is build an altar to God. So that shows you the reverence that he had for God. And then the last thing that we see in chapters 7 and 8 of the story is that God makes a promise to mankind through a covenant, right? And we'll talk about that a little bit more in chapter 9, okay? So now let's go over to the book of Jasher. Now, the book of Jasher is one of the books in the lost books, right? And so these are some of the books that we're now studying to kind of understand how the Bible fits together, hear other stories that are out there about some of the biblical characters. And so here's some of the highlights that we saw that I found from the book of Jasher, which I highly recommend. Hey, go watch it yourself. They do have audio versions on YouTube if you want to listen on YouTube, as well as written versions on the internet as well. So just here's some of the highlights. And Jasher 6 correlates to Genesis 7 and 8. Okay. So the first thing that you're going to see in the book of Jasher is that it just gives you a little bit more details. Like you hear about the animals actually coming up to the ark and some of the things that happen. You see even at one point two animals start fighting each other as they're coming onto the ark, right? You also see a little bit more. I feel like in Genesis there's a lot of information about how the ark was built, the exact measurements, the cubics, all these kind of things. And in the book of Jasher, it seems to talk a little bit more about the preparation that Noah went through, right? So it talked about, getting food for the animals, making sure that there was enough food for the animals, making sure there was enough food for the family, right? They didn't know how long they were going to be on this ark. They'd never even seen rain before, right? But God was giving him instructions for how to prepare. It also states, which I thought was really interesting in the book of Jasher, that Noah went around and preached for 120 years while he was building the ark because he was hoping to save some. But people had been so overtaken by their own beliefs and doing things their own way. And there was so much evil on the earth that they didn't listen, right? They didn't listen. They didn't want to do things God's way. And so for me, again, so last week, looking at this from the aspect of, man, God did this to save the world, not necessarily to punish the world, right? Growing up, I would always look at the story and kind of be like, so you mean to tell me there wasn't not one person, and God just made this decision, and then all of a sudden, people are gonna die. And it's like, well, actually, if you look at some of these other books, you see that it's kind of not really like that. Like he gave them more and more opportunities, right? And so it said that Noah preached for 120 years. So Noah's a preacher, right? Preached for 120 years, really trying to save people, and they just wouldn't listen. And then it says that the rain started, right? So remember when Noah was going around and preaching, people probably looked at him like he was crazy. Rain, okay, water's going to come from the sky. Really? And we're all going to die. Really? But when the rain started, people started to ask Noah or to scream out to Noah, hey, let us on the ark, let us on the ark. And he denies them. He basically says, I preached to you for 100 years. I preached to you about your wrongdoings and you didn't listen. And now this is your fate. And then it talks about how the waters overtook them, the people and the beasts of the field. So it's really interesting. So I highly recommend, take a look at the book of Asher. It also mentions in there kind of what it was like on the boat. It doesn't give you a lot of information, but it does say things like, as the boat was, tossing and turning, the animals started howling, and Noah and his family became afraid. And at one point it even says that Noah starts to pray to God and like, hey, when is this going to be over? Right? So I thought it was just really interesting. It just gives you more information. And then it ends the same way that Genesis 8 ends, where it gives you the Noahic covenant. All right. Hey, Amber, do we have anything in the chat? I see some stuff, but let me see real quick.
Yes, actually we do. Allie wanted to know if Jasher is in the Apocrypha.
Yes. I want to say yes. I can't remember if it's in the Apocrypha or the Pseudepigrapha. But let me get back to you by the end of this. But I think it is in the Apocrypha. If it's not, it's in the Pseudepigrapha.
Okay.
Yeah. Awesome. Somebody said, I want to go. Let's do a trip. Let's put together a trip. All right. So let's go over to Genesis 9, right? So again, like I said, the book of Jasher also talks about exactly what we're about to talk about, and that's the Noahic covenant. Now, what you're going to see all throughout the Bible is that God has several covenants that he makes with man. The first one is the Adamic. I hope I'm pronouncing it that right? The Adamic, right? So the covenant he makes with Adam. So you remember what we've been talking about the last couple of weeks, giving him dominion over the world, giving him dominion over the animals. He just had to make the promise he wouldn't eat from the tree of knowledge, which we see that he broke that promise, right? Well, the Noahic covenant comes at the end of the flood. Now, here's a couple of things in the research that I've done when it comes to covenants. Here's a couple of things that they always contain. They always contain a promise. They also contain terms and conditions, right? Like, okay, hey, this is what I'm promising you. You will have this, you will have that, but you have to do this, right? You have to live your life in a certain way. There's always blood of some sort, and then there's always a seal. And so with the Noahic covenant, you'll see it in verses 1 through 17. of Genesis chapter 9, the promise is that he will never destroy earth by water again, right? So that's the promise that God makes. I will never destroy mankind. I will never destroy earth by water again. Now he will destroy earth again, but this time it'll be by fire, right? At the end of time. The terms, he gives Noah and his family instructions, the same instructions he gave to Adam, really: multiply the earth, subdue the animals, right? And this time, so remember in Genesis 1, I think it was Genesis 1 or 2, and we were talking about, hey, it never mentions that about eating meat. Well, here in Genesis 9, this is the first time where we see God talking about eating meat. And he says, hey, I'm giving you the animals to subdue. You can subdue them, you can also eat them. And he says, but do not eat anything that has living blood in it, right? So he makes some stipulation, right? And so when we look at even Jewish, I'm sorry, what's the word I'm looking for? Can anybody think of the word I'm looking for? It's the way that Jews eat. What's the word? It's slipping my brain. It's gonna come back to me, right?
Is it halal?
Huh? Yes, yes, yes,
Halal?
yes, yes.
Am I making
So
that up?
yeah, so the way that they eat, you'll see a lot of this in the book of Genesis. You'll also see a lot in the book of Deuteronomy as well. But one of the things is you'll notice that they do not eat meat that has living blood in it. And this is the first time God mentions it, right? And then he adds something. He adds something that's a little bit different than when he first makes a covenant with Adam. This time he says, anyone who kills will be killed, right? Because think about what was happening on the earth since the time of Adam, right? We see Adam and Eve get thrown out of the garden. The next major thing that happens is Cain and Abel, they grow up, and then we see Cain kill Abel, right? Then we start to see more murder. We start to see more evil come to the point where God actually has to destroy the earth because people are so evil and the things that they are doing, right? And so now God is like, okay, I guess, he's like, listen, we need to have some ramifications here. Like, let's stop this. All right, so anyone who kills, you will be killed. And he even goes as far in Genesis 9 to say, if an animal kills a human, kill that animal, right? Because it has to be blood for blood. So that's an interesting thing with the Noahic covenant. The blood, of course, was the flood waters destroying all life. And then the seal is the rainbow, right? So God gave us rainbows as a reminder that he will never destroy earth by water again. So now let's get to the second part of Genesis 9, which is a really interesting part of the story, where we talk about Noah's sons. And this is something that, a lot of people have issues with in the Bible. And so we're going to really dive into it. The curse of Ham, or the curse of Canaan, right? So let's actually read the story just so that we're all on the same page. So if you all are with me, I'm in Genesis 9, verses 18. We're going to read 18 through 28. And it says, the sons of Noah who came out of the boat with their father were Shem, Ham, Japheth, right? Ham is the father of Canaan. From these three sons, Noah came all people who now populate the earth. After the flood, Noah began to cultivate the ground, and he planted a vineyard. One day he drank some wine he had made, and he became drunk and lay naked inside his tent. Ham, the father of Canaan, saw that his father was naked and went outside and told his brothers. Then Shem and Japheth took a robe, they held it over their shoulders and backed into the tent to cover their father. As they did this, they looked the other way so they would not see him naked. When Noah woke up from his stupor, he learned what Ham, his youngest son, had done. Then he cursed Canaan, the son of Ham. May Canaan be cursed. May he be the lowest of servants to his relatives. Then Noah said, may the Lord, the God of Shem, be blessed, and may Canaan be his servant. May God expand the territory of Japheth. May Japheth share the prosperity of Shem, and may Canaan be his servant. Noah lived another 350 years. And after the great flood, he lived 950 years, and then he died. Okay, so why is this such a controversial passage in the Bible. Okay, so it brings a couple of questions. Number one, why did Noah curse Canaan instead of Ham? Right? If Canaan was the one who actually did something wrong, why was Canaan the one who was? Why was his line and his descendants the ones that were cursed? So we'll talk about that. The second question a lot of people have is, why do people associate the curse of Ham with the African races? And so we'll really get into that. Okay, so first and foremost, one thing that you have to understand when we start looking at some things in the Bible, that there are some things the Bible doesn't tell us. And so what has happened over time and generations is people try to put things together because they try to make sense of God's word, which makes sense, right? And so with that said, I did a lot of research this week. And so there are a lot of different theories when it comes to biblical scholars as to why Canaan was cursed instead of Ham, right? So one theory that gets talked a lot about is the fact of, even though it doesn't say Canaan was with him, that perhaps Canaan was with Ham. So even though the Bible doesn't talk about it, that maybe Canaan was standing in the tent as well. And so he shared in making fun or mocking his grandfather in his nakedness and his drunkenness, right? So that's one theory. Again, remember, these are all theories because the Bible itself doesn't really give us the answer. There are some people who believe that God didn't want to punish, or I'm sorry, that Noah didn't want to punish all of Ham's descendants, and so therefore he chose one line of um of of his descendants, and Canaan was the firstborn, and so it was almost like, okay, I'm punishing your firstborn line of your people for what you did. The other theory that people say is that Noah knew ahead of time that the people that were going to come from Canaan were going to be evil people. And so he already just had and so if he was going to punish Ham, he decided to punish that line because he already knew that those were going to be the people who were going to go into evil. So again, all theory, none of it is actually known. All we really know is that for whatever reason, when Noah learned what Ham did, he cursed Canaan. Okay, now let's go to the second question and the second controversial part of this. Why do people associate the curse of Ham with African races? So I don't know how many of you have ever heard people say, oh, the reason why slavery happened, things like that, was because from the beginning of time, God has made it clear that we were supposed to be the servants of others. Well, let's debunk that right now. Right? So here's one thing that you're going to learn when you really start looking at biblical history and church history. Biblical meanings have changed throughout time. So there are things, and that's why I'm very big on, well, what do these other lost books say? Because back in time, people read those books just as much as they read any of the other books, right? It wasn't until the Bible was canonized that they said, hey, we're going to remove this book, we're going to include this book goes, this book stays, right? But before that, people read all of the stories. They took lessons from all of those stories, right? So the earliest that we can find of people kind of distinguishing or separating the three groups of people that came from Noah is the 12th century, right? So if we look at biblical history in the 12th century, they separated people in the world based on these three people: Shem, Japheth, and Ham, right? But those people were separated by character groups. So the idea was anyone who was free, because remember, the transatlantic slave trade in America was the first time really that race was associated with slavery. In every society on earth, there was some form of slavery, right? So slavery wasn't based on race. Really, slavery was based on money and debt. That was what a lot of slavery was based on. Or war. I went to war. I'm taking your people. You people are now my slaves, right? So the idea was there are three types of people in this world. There are free people, there are soldiers, right? Because people went to war, and then there are servants, right? So free people are like Shem. They have the character of Shem. And so they will get the blessings of Shem. Japheth, those are soldiers, they are fighters, right? So they will get the blessing of Japheth. Ham, these are the people in the world who are servants, and they are cursed because of their character, because the idea was Ham was not an honorable person because of what he did to his father, laughing at his father. So he was an evil person. So evil people are supposed to be servants. You all see that? So in the 12th century, this is like what everybody believed, right? When it came to Noah and his three sons, or at least this was what was taught. By the 13th century, it had switched a little bit that Shem were priests. So anyone who was considered a priest or a preacher or someone who was of religion, someone who was pious, right? A religious person was considered to have the character of Shem, right? And so you would get the blessings of Shem because of the fact that you were, living in alignment with God's word. Japheth were fighters, right? Or people in the knighthood. Right? So same thing, you would get the blessing of Japheth if you were somebody who fought for your country. And then workers or working class people were known as like the people of Ham. Okay? It wasn't until the 15th century where this ideology started to kind of change a bit. Does anybody remember what else happened in the 15th century? European exploration, right? So we had European exploration happening around the world. They're starting to see, wow, people look different here. And so this is the first time in history where we start to see imagery. So you start to see paintings. We start to see books about it. We start to see people referring to these three groups of people by races or colors, right? And so the people of Shem were supposed to be white people, people from the Euro area. People of Japheth were all the people in between. So I guess that's Asian, Latino, anything in between, right? The mid-hued people, if you will. And then the people of Ham were associated with Black people. They also changed the definition of Ham. So if you even look up definitions now, remember, definitions are created by people. If you look up the definition of Ham, they associated the word Black with Ham, but it wasn't originally like that. As a matter of fact, if you look at the original Hebrew of what Ham was associated with, it meant hot, right? And so that could have meant temperament, that could have meant any of those things, but they chose to associate that with Black, right? And so it's important to also remember that all throughout history, Ham is always associated with bad characteristics of society, right? So he's associated with idolatry. There are some thoughts, right, or beliefs that remember all of the stuff that was happening before, right? We talked about the book of Enoch and saying like the angels came down, the watchers came down and taught them witchcraft, taught them, how to make swords, how to go to war, how to do all of this stuff, how to use plants, right, to make spells and things like that, right? And so there are some people who believe that Ham bought that onto the boat, like he continued that tradition, even though God tried to wash it out with the world, right? There's nothing in the Bible that says that, but that's what a lot of people believe, right? So anything pretty much sexual perversion, there's even, stories around the idea that on the boat, Noah told his family, because remember, it's him and his wife and his three sons and their wives, while we're on this ark, no one is to have sex, right? And so there are people who believe that Ham and his wife actually did, have intercourse. And so he's associated with sexual perversion. So Ham is always associated with bad characteristics. So now when you start associating Ham with bad characteristics, and then you also associate Black with Ham, some very bad things start to happen, right? So what we see is by the 19th century, the story of Ham begins to be used by white Southern preachers to make people feel better about slavery, right? Because there were a lot of people who were against slavery, and there are people who were for slavery, and they're like, we need this free labor, right? And so they needed a way to make it okay to be religious and own slaves. And so there was one man in particular, his name was Benjamin Morgan Palmer. He was the pastor of First Presbyterian Church in New Orleans back in the 1800s. I can't remember the exact date, but back in the 1800s. And there's a beautiful talk. I don't know, I wouldn't say a documentary, but a beautiful talk by Rhodes College, which kind of gives you all of this history and this information, if you guys want to check that out. But he had a church in New Orleans, and he actually was the man who started Rhodes College. But he basically went around preaching this very message right here, that the reason why it was not only okay but good to enslave Africans was because of this association of Ham with being the black people of the world, right? Now, it's amazing to me that everyone fell in line with this, but nobody, I'm like, how in the world did anybody ever ask, how did Noah and his wife give birth to 3 different races of people? So one of his sons was white, one of his sons was Asian, and one of his sons was black. Don't make no sense. It makes no sense. The way in which it was interpreted earlier makes a lot more sense, that these were characteristics, right, of people. But that's basically what they use to really push this association with the fact that slavery, that God wanted African Americans or Africans in general to be enslaved, right? And so that followed through generations to the point where there are people who still believe that to this day, that the Bible actually says that we were supposed to be enslaved, and it never does, right? Also, this is the only where in the Bible where people can make any association with race and slavery. Nowhere else in the Bible do you see any type of relation, and they created a relationship with it in the story of Noah and his sons. All right. Is that good? Did a lot of research, y'all, for y'all, right? Let me just make sure. Let me see if there's any comments real quick. Awesome. Thank you for putting the apocrypha there. Yes. We're going to get to that, Allie. Yes, that's the next part. Yes. So what Allie said in the comment section, for those of you who are on YouTube, she said, I thought it also has something to do with Babel. Yes, it does, as the story continues, right? So let's get into Genesis 10, Allie. Genesis 10, and also for those of you who want to read Jasher, Genesis 10 and Jasher 7 kind of relate to each other. They kind of go together, all right? Now, in the story of Genesis 10, what we basically see is God starts to give the genealogy. So we start to see the peoples of the world. We start to see the different tribes of the world. And basically, he describes the descendants of Japheth. He describes the descendants of Ham. He also describes the descendants of Shem, right? And so he's just listing people, and this person had this person, and this, right? Listing all these tribes. And then the Bible, interestingly enough, stops at one person. So they mention all of these people, but then there's one person that they stop and talk about. So let's read about this one person. So we're in Genesis chapter 10, and we're going to look at verse 8. So this is in the descendants of Ham. Okay. It says, Cush was also the ancestor of Nimrod, who was the first heroic warrior on earth. Since he was the greatest hunter in the world, his name became proverbial. People would say, this man is like Nimrod, the greatest hunter in the world. He built his kingdom in the land of Babylonia. And for those of you all who have different versions, I'm reading out of the NLT. It says Babel, right? So he built the kingdom of Babylonia with the cities of Babylon, Erech, Akbad, and Calneh. And from this, he expanded his territory to Assyria, building the city of Nineveh, Rehoboth, Calah, and Renzin, the great city located between Nineveh and Calah. Okay, now, so those few scriptures, those little 4 scriptures, that's all we hear about Nimrod. However, if we go over to the book of Jasher, guess what the book of Jasher does? It gives us the full story of who Nimrod was, right? So this is what the book of Jasher says. So the book of Jasher says, remember in Genesis 1, when God made, when Adam and Eve sinned, and so they started sewing leaves together to cover themselves. And so once God, sent them out of the garden. He's like, okay, let me help you, right? Let me actually give you some coverings. And so he gave them animal skins to cover themselves, right? And so it says in the book of Jasher that the garments that God made for Adam and Eve, that there was a blessing on those garments, right? So they had some sort of power with them, right? They were blessed and anointed, I guess. And those garments were actually passed down through the generations. Of course, remember, Cain left and went away. Adam and Eve had more sons, but Seth was the son to replace Abel, right? So he was the third son. So it is believed that the garments were passed down through Seth's descendants, right? And so remember, Enoch and Noah were descendants of Seth. So these garments are passed down through the generation. And Noah wanted to preserve them. So when he went on the ark, he took the garments with him, right? So in the book of Jasher, it says that Ham stole the clothing, right? And he passed it down through his generations, right? Because remember, Ham was the baby son. He was the youngest. And so how do things mostly get passed down? Through the firstborn. So it says that Ham actually stole the garments and passed it down to his descendants, right? He passed it down to Cush, and then he passed it down, and then Cush passed it down to Nimrod, who we see in Genesis 10. And it said that Nimrod wore the clothes, and that's how he became a powerful warrior. And so he was so powerful, it was like no one could beat him, right? Like he was just this really amazing man. It says that he went to war with Japheth and won. And when he won that war, it was like people just followed him and people loved him. And so they actually made him a king. They're like, you should be our king because you're the most powerful man in the world. Nobody can stop you, that kind of thing, right? And so his name became great, his power became great, but there was one problem. Nimrod did not honor God. So Nimrod was evil. He actually made idols, right? He made idols of wood, right? So he was teaching his people to worship false gods, right? And then he actually had a son named Mardon, and his son became even more evil than him, right? And so now what we're starting to see is this evil starting to pass down through generations again. And as you continue in the book of Jasher, you'll start to see the same characters that you see in Genesis. It's really interesting. But as Allie just said, the belief is that he was the one who started Babylon, or Babel, which we'll talk about next week, what was going on in Babel and how that changed the world. But that's who Nimrod was. And so the book of Jasher gives you kind of the full story of that, which is pretty awesome. And so that's where we wrap up for Genesis 7, 8, 9, and 10. And so next week, we'll actually take a look at Genesis 11, which is the Tower of Babel. And we're going to look at what happens there, how people start speaking different languages. We'll look at why God wanted to stop them from doing what they were doing. It's going to be really interesting. Before we jump off, do we have any questions or comments or anything that anyone would like to add into the conversation tonight?
From what I see from the comments, Alexia would like to know which version would be best or does have Jasher in it.
You can do any, like I said, it's even on YouTube. Like you can listen to the audio on YouTube, and I'm always like, do free if you can do free. So they have audio versions on YouTube. The book of the Apocrypha that I have, I downloaded mine from Amazon. Like I have mine on Amazon Kindle, and I read it from there. So but yeah, like I totally say go on YouTube and listen to it because it's there. It's about 3 hours long, the whole book, but you can break it up into pieces.
That's a very good point. Thank you. And I think that is all. Does anybody have any questions there on Zoom as well? Any other questions?
I do see one here from Allie who says, I keep missing the Apocrypha study. How do I join? You actually don't. So this is what happened, everybody. I have been traveling. So what we're trying to do is, so I'm basically canceling the Saturday Bible study, everybody, because I just keep being like out of town or traveling on that day. So what I'm trying to do is do them together all on one in the Tuesday night. So that's why we talked about, like, tonight, the book of Jasher, and we talked about Genesis and how it fits together. So that's how we have to do it, just because I'm in the middle of some transitions. So I'm doing a lot of international travel back and forth. So it just, one Bible study a week is better for me. So I'm trying to blend it as much as possible. So join us on Tuesday night. So definitely watch the replay. Awesome. Alexia said the research on Ham. Yes. It's like when you really start to get into it, you're like, oh my gosh, I didn't know that. And I don't know if I recommended, but there was a book. Hang on one second. Let me go back for anybody who needs to see it. This book right here, Noah's Curse by Stephen R. Haynes. This has a lot of good information in there. There's also, there's always stuff online, even on YouTube. You'll hear different biblical scholars and researchers who really dive deep into these different things. But yeah, I was amazed myself when I really started digging, and I'm like, where did this come from? Like, where did this idea come from? And the idea that it literally didn't come until, like, really the 18th century, because even in the 15th century, it was just associated with race, right? But it was the 18th century where you really see this push of, like, oh yeah, this is what that means, and this is why it's okay for us to enslave people, right? That's why it's really good, as we're doing our biblical research, yes, read the Bible. I tell people all the time, read the Bible, but also read history, because there are so many things that have been changed. There's so many things that have been updated, and there are so many things that we believe and do simply out of tradition, and we think that it's actually in the Bible, but it's not. It's just something that we've been hearing our whole lives. And so it's just ingrained in us. And so what I really want for all of us, the whole reason of doing this, is I really want us to get into our Bible and say, what does the Bible actually say? What does it actually say? Not what have I been taught? What, do I believe? What does it actually say? Because, like I said, church tradition has changed things over the generations. And even though we have the Bible, and yes, we're a follower of God's, people are still people. There was the person who really pushed this idea was a pastor. The person who really pushed this idea started a biblical college for people to learn more and really understand God's word. But he was pushing racist sentiments. So it's important for us to get into the word on our own. It's important for us to research on our own. It's important to do, to do the reading, to do the work on our own, so that we understand exactly what it is that we believe and why we believe what we believe. Yeah, exactly. Thinking that people of color are cursed. Yeah. I grew up hearing that, and thinking, well, God, why? How can you say you love me, but then you say my people are cursed? And the craziest thing of that also is that it never says God made that curse anyway. It says Noah did. Isn't that interesting? Right? Yeah. Yep. So awesome. Awesome, everybody. Well, thank you all so much for attending another session. I hope that you have an amazingly blessed week. Please go back and read these scriptures, pray over them. And definitely, if you get some more insight, send us an email. Let us know, because we want to hear your thoughts. We want to know, how this is blessing you. And so all of you on YouTube, thank you again for tuning in live. And we will see you next week, where we'll talk about the Tower of Babel. Have a good night, everybody. Bye-bye.